What are some events in recorded history that are extremely hard to believe, but without a doubt actually happened? Halley's Comet appeared in the sky when Mark Twain was born in 1835. The comet moves in a 75 or 76-year orbit, and as it neared Earth once again, Twain said, "I came in with Halley's Comet, and I expect to go out with it." Sure enough, he died on April 21, 1910, just as the comet made its next pass within sight of Earth. He was an alien who got dropped off for a vacation via the interstellar transit, and then was picked up the next time it came around. My colleague was on the plane to Hawaii, where the entire top of the plane ripped off. They flew the rest of the way without any overhead, landed, and everyone walked off. Absolutely insane to see the picture. Talk about being given a second chance. My file was on a flight. He always keeps his seatbelt on unless getting up for some reason. Lady beside him made a comment, "You can take your seatbelt off." Now he told her he never does unless it's necessary. Said you never know if something's going to happen, and you don't want to be trying to get buckled in. In an emergency, she said, "You know what?" That makes a lot of sense, and she buckled back up. An hour later, they hit some nasty turbulence and the plane dropped like a rock. Forget how many feet, but it was substantial. The drop was so fast that the flight attendant and her cart smashed against the ceiling and then dropped back down. He said he was sure he was done for. Other passengers not buckled in also hit the ceiling. Many people had bumps and bruises, and I think at least one had a broken arm. The lady beside him just kept thanking him over and over for convincing her to stay buckled. The incident was in the news, and he got 2 free flights out of it as an apology. "We are sorry we almost killed you. Let us do that 2 more times." Aloha Airlines Flight 243, for those not familiar with it. Not only could kids now not believe it, the public couldn't hardly believe it at the time. Only one death, a flight attendant who wasn't buckled in the seat at the time the roof ripped off. The aircraft had reached its normal flight altitude of 24,000 feet. One fatality occurred, 58-year-old flight attendant Clarabelle, CB, Lansing, who was swept out of the airplane while standing near the 5th row seats. Her body was never found. I really hope she passed out before falling 24,000 feet into the ocean. The Nosby report says the flight attendant was pulled through an opening of jagged metal and mentions bloodstains both on the seats near that location and on the outside of the aircraft. In some photos taken just after landing, you could see a bloodstain in the shape of a skull on the left side of the fuselage. So at least, she was probably unconscious before she even realized what happened. I guess that's why we wear seatbelts on a planet. In 1908, Russia showed up 12 days late to the Olympics because the world switched calendars while they did not. To accommodate the Russian team, some events were rescheduled so that the Russian athletes could participate. This led to a longer duration for those Olympics, which lasted from April 27 to October 31, making it the longest Olympic Games in history. I love that they just waited for them, though. Why didn't they just go when they saw they were late? Before realizing there wasn't TV or international flights in 1908. This observation is right up there with the time I wondered out loud why audiobooks didn't have subtitles. The Battle of Bull Run, one of the first battles of the U.S. Civil War, occurred on and around Wilmer McLean's farm in Northern Virginia. Not wanting to live surrounded by war, McLean and his family moved to Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. The Battle of Appomattox Courthouse was the last significant battle between Union and Confederate forces. The Confederates signed the surrender order in Wilmer's sitting room. It is said that the Civil War started on Wilmer's farm and ended in his sitting room. He was not happy about it either. As he stated, he had moved specifically to get away from the war as much as he possibly could. Every time I think I'm out, they pull me back in. There was a Japanese man called Tsutomu Yamaguchi who was on his way to work in Hiroshima in 1945 when he saw falling through the sky 2 miles from where he stood what ultimately turned out to be the atomic bomb. He had just enough time to take cover in a ditch as the bomb detonated, and miraculously he survived. Somehow, the Hiroshima train station was still operational, and so Yamaguchi, battered, bombed and bruised, decided to board a train to his family home so he could recover in Nagasaki. 3 days later, Yamaguchi was called into work to explain what he saw, which he did. At work, as he began to tell the story of what happened, the second bomb dropped. It was the reinforced concrete walls around him that saved him this time, and Yamaguchi quickly ran to find his wife and son. Ground temperatures in the city reached 4,000 dec and radioactive rain poured down. The family's home was destroyed, but Yamaguchi's wife and son had thankfully been out shopping, looking for burn ointment for Yamaguchi, when the bomb fell and they'd survived. Despite this ordeal of having survived 2 nuclear explosions and subsequent radiation exposure, Yamaguchi went on to live till 93 years of age. He died in 2010 after being recognized by the Japanese government as a Naiju Hibakusha, or twice bombed person. The family's home was destroyed, but Yamaguchi's wife and son had thankfully been out shopping, looking for burn ointment for Yamaguchi, when the bomb fell and they'd survived. Didn't know about this part. I suppose it would have been quite the kick to the nuts if they'd perished and he'd survived twice. It's honestly amazing to think that had he died at Hiroshima, his wife and son likely would have died at Nagasaki as there would have been no reason to be in the outskirts of the city that day. His good fortune horrible experience ultimately saved his family via butterfly effect. That reminds me of another famous Japanese person during that time. Chune Sugihara was the vice consul for the Japanese embassy in Lithuania, which is in Europa, during World War II. Many Jews came to him for help because they wanted to flee from the ever-expanding Nazi Empire, and he just gave them all visas. He wasn't supposed to do that, and in fact he got in trouble with his government for it. But by the time he was recalled to Japan, he had already saved many thousands of lives. The Jews then took the Trans-Siberian Railway and a boat to get to Japan. Today he is of course no longer around, but he is one of the righteous among the nation. What's make that story more unbelievable is the Nazi John Heinrich Detlef Rabe, who was a German businessman and Nazi party member, best known for his efforts to stop war crimes during the Japanese Nanjing massacre and his work to protect and help Chinese civilians during the massacre that ensued. The Nanking Safety Zone, which he helped to establish, sheltered approximately 250,000 Chinese people from being killed. He officially represented Germany and acted as senior chief of the European, US, establishment that remained in Nanjing. So we have a Japanese who saved lots of Jews from persecution and a German who saved a lot of Chinese from a certain death. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. Leonard Cohen. In 2014, Pope Francis released doves in the Vatican to symbolize his hopes for peace in the world. As soon as the doves began to fly, a seagull and a crow swooped down and attacked them in front of everyone. Tepsu, Google Comamps, The Guardian, Comworld 2014, John 26 Pope, doves, attacked by crow, seagull, squatters, square. That's fucking ominous. Nicholas Alchemard fell 18,000 feet without a parachute from a burning plane in 1944 and suffered no serious injury. I see how the snow cover helped, but how he didn't get skewered by pine trees or break a single bone is shocking. Imagine what he was thinking when he got up from that fall. What kind of crazy thoughts were running through his head. Yeah, no one is gonna believe this one. Germans almost didn't, finding him in just a flight suit but no parachute. They initially pegged him as a spy who'd been dropped behind their lines and had stashed his chute and gear. As such, he was likely to be executed. Except Alchemard was so insistent, his captors went and found the wreckage of his aircraft, with the burnt remains of his chute stashed behind his gun position. Germans told him the news and shared vodka with him to celebrate. The good news is we believe you're not a spy. The bad news is that means you're a pal. I'm thinking he looks up, then his legs, then up again, and screams, "Holy shit. Ooh, am I immortal? I'm fucking invincible." If you are ever in that situation, dense pine trees are about the best thing you can hope. Only thing better is dense pine trees in an area with fresh powder snow. Trees' branches typically are thinnest at the top, and every branch you hit on the way down transfers your momentum in increment. Typically you'll still die, and double typically you'll at least break your legs. And triple typically you would still succumb to your wounds in the wilderness before rescue. On second thought, aim for the pavement. There goes my hero. Juliana Koepke did the same at 17 years of age. Eps N M Wikipedia, Ogwiki Julianeshko Epke. She became famous at the age of 17 as the sole survivor of the 1971 Lancer Flight 508 plane crash after falling 3,000 mg 10,000 ft while strapped to her seat and suffering numerous injuries. She survived 11 days alone in the Amazon rainforest. Local fishermen rescued her. Tepsen, Wikipedia, Ogwikivisnovolovi, T4% 87 Vesna was on board a plane that was blown up, working as a flight attendant. She was at 10,000 when she fell. Then she went back to work after breaking nearly every bone in her body. Olga of Kiev. Her story is the ultimate revenge tale. I highly recommend people looking her up, but in short, her husband was killed by a neighboring tribe and she sought vengeance. Here is where you can find a much more in-depth overview of her life. The neighboring faction then sought to take over her own, seeing as she was a weak woman and ruling in her dead husband's place, as her own son was too young. She invited them to her town as a show of honor. When the large party of messengers arrived, they were soon attacked and backed into a massive trench that Olga's people had dug the nights before. Standing over the trench, she asked them if they found the honor to their taste and buried them alive. But she wasn't even close to finished with her quest for vengeance. She sent a message back to the enemy saying she would accept an allegiance by marriage, painting herself as such a feeble woman that she would gladly relinquish her power to her enemy. But she requested all high chieftains to visit her town to socialize and garner favor. The chieftains came. She invited them into the bathhouse to relax before a feast. They were locked inside and burned to death. But she wasn't done. Her next feat is her most incredible. After taking out most people of power from the other faction, she demanded tribute from their towns and villages. Not in gold, not in any material goods, but in the form of sparrows and pigeons. Thousands were delivered to her. The next night, she ordered her soldiers to tie a strip of sulfur to the birds' legs, set it alight, and release the birds. The birds flew back to the houses and homes they had nested in, and burned every village to the ground. The sky was apparently a blaze of fire for days. Olga emerged victorious and satiated. Don't fuck with Olga of Kiev, she is known, quite aptly, as the patron saint of vengeance and defiance. That time everyone died of a dancing sickness, where they danced themselves to death in France. Mass hysteria. Yup, St. Vitus's dance, as it is called, still doesn't have a definitely known cause. If I remember correctly either. Somebody correct me if I'm wrong, please. New research as of 2021 shows Satan and Korea as the most likely cause. Arteps, UW brain and life, or Gartical synonym, Korea, status, dance, name. IERC, one of the most compelling arguments is ergot poisoning. But it could just be mass psychosis with no real reason behind it. Wasn't this in a Scooby-Doo? Found it. Scooby-Doo, Mystery Incorporated, Stew 18, Dance of the Undead. Michael Malloy, aka Mike, the durable aka Iron Mike. During the Great Depression, 5 men took out a life insurance policy on a homeless alcoholic that they were sure was going to drink himself to death. The owner of a bar allowed him to drink for free, but he kept drinking and didn't die. So they tried to poison him with antifreeze. Didn't work. The turpentine, horse liniment, rat poison, methanol, still didn't work. A sandwich made with rotten sardines and tacks. Still no luck. Then they took his drunk body out in the cold and poured water on him. He lived. Then they ran him over with a car. He was in the hospital for 3 weeks, but survived. Then they poisoned him with carbon monoxide, and he finally died. They were all convicted of murder. So they tried to poison him with antifreeze. Fun fact, ethyl alcohol is an antidote to ethylene glycol poisoning. They both bind to the same receptors, are metabolized by the same enzyme, but alcohol takes priority. A serious alcoholic, when drunk, would just pass the glycol through their system with no issue. Gonna start an alcohol addiction, just so no one can kill me with antifreeze. Gonna make sure my dog is also an alcoholic. Veterinarians hate this one trick. It's so wild that you could buy life insurance on someone who isn't like your spouse or whatever edit. Okay, y'all, I appreciate it. But after the 10th link to the Walmart situation, I got a pretty good handle on it, haha. In the neighborhood I grew up in, many have passed due to partying, drinking, drugging, smoking, whatever. So at a funeral for one of them, standing there talking to my buddy, who had his shit together and had his own insurance agency, who would be next, and he told me you could pretty much take out a $20,000 policy on anyone. My wife's ex-husbands, father and brothers, were in the insurance businesses, and when the father died, there was a rift in the family, because the brother had millions in life influence on the father. It is totally wild. John O'Neill, the FBI agent in charge of investigating Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden in the 1990s, grew frustrated with the bureaucratic politics within the FBI and between the FBI and between the FBI and CIA. that he felt hampered his mission. He decided to leave the FBI and take a higher-paying job in the private sector. In August 23, 2001, he became the chief of security at the World Trade Center. He was killed in the attacks just a few weeks later. Looks like someone had a grudge to settle. Per Wikipedia, John O'Neill sent a colleague to the CIA to work under Richard Blee, who headed the Bin Laden division. John's colleague at the CIA found out that Osama bin Laden's associates, Nawaf al-Hazmi and Khalid al-Mihdhar, were headed to the US with visas. Rossini, John's appointed colleague, and his Doug Miller attempted to alert O'Neill at the FBI, but Blee, the head of the bin Laden division, blocked their message. Welp, that's unfortunate. The Battle of Halis in roughly 6th century BCE, the Medes and the Lydians were at war. The war had lasted for 6 years and climaxed at the Battle of Halis. During the Battle, a solar eclipse began. Both sides believed that the gods were angry at their long and bloody war and were taking the sun away from them. They declared peace that day, and the sun was returned. But a war ended because of a solar eclipse. Edit. So many historians. Wow. Guys, I didn't try to give a lecture. I just tried to give an example, which is why I didn't go into massive detail. This is the gist of it. Fuck you, unsuns your sun. Sun Tzu, Sun. No sun for Tzu. Tu sun, tu Tzu. We need more solar eclipses. Well, it depends. The Aztecs sacrificed people on the solar eclipses to calm the rage of the gods. World is still here, so it worked. I see rebellion stopped because of a tsunami hotps, and Wikipedia, or Greek insurgency, aka insurgency, fair peace agreement. The Mongols failed to conquer Japan due to a typhoon twice. The Battle of Castle Itter in Tabutu was fought between the Waffen-SS and a group comprised of American and German soldiers, local resistance fighters, and several French celebrities, including Paul Renal, who had been the Prime Minister of France during World War I, including a tennis player who lobbed grenades through opened windows with his racket. Yes, for real. The Nutmeg Wars. The Dutch and the English went to war 3 times over nutmeg, which at the time was only known to grow on one South Pacific island. Theodore Roosevelt found his boat was stolen, so he built a new boat, tracked the thieves down and arrested them. He then proceeded to walk them multiple days without sleeping so they could receive a trial instead of just shooting them on the spot. It was in the middle of a harsh winter, so he didn't handcuff them for fear they'd get frostbite. So instead, he just kept himself awake by reading Tolstoy with a gun trained on them the whole trek. That's only the 22nd most Teddy thing I've ever read, but a new one which makes me love it. I am always half convinced that Teddy Roosevelt was not a real person. No one could have been that absolutely wild and done that many things, but there is just too much overwhelming proof. He was also hyper-aware of his public image and was basically his own peer firm. He also was a bit of a weeb and made his judo instructor fight his boxing instructor, the judo instructor, with Judo Instructor 1. In 2019, a convicted murderer on day release bravely fought off a terrorist at London Bridge with a narwhal tusk. Hatbeps, WBSC Company Newsuk, 50,870,309 edited to add that he was a convicted murderer, thanks to Rainbow Warrior her, thanks to reminding me. Edited again to add that the guy with the narwhal tusk was a civil servant and the convict on day release battled the terrorist with a fire extinguisher. This story gets more awesome with every correction. Almost as good as the Scottish bloke who kicked that airport van attacker so hard in the balls he broke his foot while the dude was on fire. Alex Missilvain famously kicked the terrorist so hard in the groin that he tore a tendon in his own foot. In 2020 in Sydney, Australia, a bystander managed to take down a guy who was on a rampage with a knife by pinning him down with a milk crate. Edit. It was 2019. My bad. Edwin Booth, brother of John Wilkes Booth, saved the life of Robert the son of President Abraham Lincoln. John, the blind king of Bohemia, insisted on fighting in battle and had his aides tie their horses together so they were not separated. He asked to be taken to where the battle was the loudest. The next day, they were all found dead with their horses still tied together. Edit, he didn't have aides that we know of, but aides. Oh geez. On one hand, respectable to want to fight. On the other hand, what was he thinking? The battle was lost, and he wasn't going to run, so he sallied forth, knowing he was going to die, and his retainers went with him. He also went blind at age 40, so he'd spent most of his life able to see and fight. This was just his last stand. Christmas Day, 1914. The truce on the one battlefields shows the humanity inside everyone, but they were able to wake up the next day and go straight back to war, kill the men that they'd spent a sincere day with. I can't remember where I heard the story. I think from the BP, but I believe from one of the last living Tommies, who said that whilst they were forced to start shooting at each other, the majority of shots intentionally missed from both sides of no man's land. I believe it was also the same man who said, in reference to Remembrance Day, to also remember the Germans. That stuck with me. They were like our lads, sent out to fight a war for war's sake, forced to do unspeakable things to other men because some higher-up told them they had to. In reference to Remembrance Day, to also remember the Germans. Australia is a bit like this with regard to the Turks on Anzac Day. One of the main ceremonies is reading the letter from Turkish commander and later founder of modern Turkey, Kemal Atatürk, those heroes that shed their blood and lost their lives. You are now lying in the soil of a friendly country. Therefore, rest in peace. There is no difference between the Johnnies and the Mehmets to us, where they lie side by side here in this country of ours. You, the mothers who sent their sons from faraway countries, wipe away your tears. Your sons are now lying in our bosom and are in peace. After having lost their lives on this land, they have become our sons as well. This incident scared the absolute shit out of the upper-level officers. I think the officers and generals made them start fighting again. They had a crazy amount of bombs the next Christmas. If you were to boil down World War I into story beats, it's a tragedy of humanity reaching new horrors, while leaders scoffed at it being anything but honorable. No wonder 1920s Paris became what it was post-war. We were so fucked up. Those kids didn't even want to be killing each other in the first place. The time Indiana tried to legislate the value of PE headspeps. W. Forbes, Komsutesky Smith 20,180,205 Indiana State Legislature. Onks tried to legislature. Once tried to legislate the value of B. Chessex Essex 199, Uni 260. That math professor was unimpressed. A member then showed the writer a copy of the bill just passed and asked him if he would like an introduction to the learned doctor, its author. He declined the courtesy with thanks, remarking that he was acquainted with as many crazy people as he cared to know. Lost my shit at that quote. The masses marching to the Berlin Wall and tearing it down only happened because earlier that day, during a press conference, an East German official, Gunther Schabowski, accidentally incorrectly said leaving East Germany was legal, effective immediately. As far as I know, this becomes effective. It is right away. Immediately is still a famous thing to say in Germany. It would eventually have happened anyway, but it wasn't legal yet. However, people just did it anyways, because the guy got visibly confused during the press conference and said the wrong thing. It happens at the very end of this video. You too, guess. In 1944, during the Allied invasion of France, two American paramedics, Ken Moore and Robert Wright, 101st Airborne, saved around 80 soldiers of both sides, Allied at Axis. They set themselves up in a church, had only what was in their first aid kits and medic bags, and had a strict no-gun policy. The church was almost destroyed by a mortar shell, but it didn't go off. It was almost destroyed again due to friendly fire. Ken Moore would risk his life by venturing out of the church and finding injured soldiers, and both medics stayed behind at the church, even though the rest of their forces had to retreat. Wright took on the responsibility of looking after the soldiers. The church still stands in Angeville, Owl Plain, France. The blood-stained pews are still there, and a broken tile from the mortar shell was never fixed to honor the legacy of these men. This is very simplified and probably inaccurate in a few ways, but it is still an incredible story. Better version of the story here, and also much more accurate. Edit, Mom, I'm famous. In 1903, the New York Times published an article about flying machines. They stated that it would take the combined efforts of all mathematicians and mechanics 1 to 10 million years for powered flight to be achieved. Anyway, about 9 weeks later, the Wright brothers achieved powered flight for the first time. Here's the article. They were also overly cynical afterwards. In 1910, they said that flight would only ever be for billionaires. Of course, we had commercial flights by around the 60s, achievable for many. People of the time couldn't look at the progress over the previous few centuries and realize we would leapfrog over it in the next few decades. I mean, I can hardly believe that this smartphone I'm typing on right now has more performance, storage and battery life than the full-size laptop I bought in 2008 that's still working, but catching dust in the cupboard. 1816, the year without summer. I'm a big classic horror fan, so I'm kinda glad this happened. Indirectly lead to Mary Shelley writing Frankenstein. I bet it was that goddamn snow miser. That's so crazy. The devastation and even the confusion by those going through it. Thanks for sharing. During Alexander the Great's destruction of the Mediterranean, he was going to leave a small island named Tyre for later, as it would be hard to besiege it, but the people of Tyre laughed and mocked him, so he literally built a bridge to their island and conquered it. The Ghost Army and we. Essentially, an American group of troops would deploy dummy tanks, broadcast fake radio chatter, and deploy loud sound effects over speakers to fool the Nazis into thinking there was a large military presence coming their way. The Ghost Army was used to deceive the Nazis and make them send their military presence elsewhere, which provided openings for the real Allied forces to move in. This was used in the later parts of the war. I never learned about this in school, but I discovered it on my own and thought it was fascinating. Imagine thinking a whole mess of tanks are heading your way, but in reality, it's a couple of inflatable dummies and a few speakers. The Great Molasses Flood of 1919 that took place in Boston, May, 40-foot wave that killed 21 people. Elevator operator Betty Lou Oliver survived a fall of 75 stories while in an elevator in 1945. I looked this up. What's insane about this is that a plane crashed where she was working and she was being rescued when she fell 70.
9 stories!
It's just insane. I still find it totally insane that we were able to put men on the moon with the technology of the time. It blows my mind. Probably the greatest of all human achievement. And it was only 66 years after the first flight of the Wright brothers. People born in the 1880s were old enough to see wooden planes take their first flights in the sky to humanity landing a man on the moon. My grandmother was born in Austria, Poland, and went from woodplow behind an ox to Neil Armstrong on the moon. I think a very close second is the fact everyone on Apollo 13 survived. Movie is really accurate and still doesn't get into all the insanity and engineering it took to get them home. Their travel around the moon is also the furthest humans have ever been from planet Earth. Just a small fact. The really funny thing is that man walked on the moon before anybody had the idea to put wheels on suitcases. Isn't that insane? They were hand-checking the fucking math. Edit. I have to add, this woman they deemed a computer did many if not most of these calculations. Early on, of course, all W NASA, Gavaudians for students Kvothers NASA, knows who was Catherine. Johnson for Catherine, Johnson for Catherine, Johnson for Catherine studied how to use geometry for space travel. She figured out the paths for the spacecraft to orbit, go around Earth and to land on the moon. NASA used Catherine's math, and it worked. NASA sent astronauts into orbit around Earth. Later, her math helped send astronauts to the moon and back. NASA could not have done these things without Katherine Johnson and her love for math. Edit 2. Just realized I chose a HK4 article. Lowell gets the job done though. The computer that ran some of the boosters was a length of rope, with knots towed at certain places that triggered them as the rope was moved by a reel-to-reel tape player. Tare Het, en Wikipedia. Ogwikitarare, this guy's whole life was an event. He was a living horror movie monster. Palm trees, among other flora, were present in Antarctica during the early Eocene epoch, between 55 and 48 million years ago. Only somewhat related, I just read an article about an extinct type of date palm that they found seeds of that are 2,000 years old, and they've recently managed to grow 6 palms, 5 male and 2 female, from them, and thus have brought back an extinct species of palm tea and its fruit. So cool. A US President Roosevelt issued an executive order that made it illegal for us citizens to keep us gold coins. They made everyone return them or be subject to imprisonment and large fine. The government confiscated over 2,600 metric ton TEPs. UW Google. Com search. Golga confiscationus. Ursonic unescu tenus 9. 149 149 9. 149 900. Confisciskis scrum. 2.05 112. 60. Nini 57 Geroi 5. 112 8.8 thousand. 700. 12 8,700. I've read that when people find buried gold in the US, it's usually from people hiding it during this time. No idea if that's true though. It's possible. It could have been buried for many different reasons. The company I work for just sold the collection of the latest find in buried treasure. It's called the Great Kentucky Hoard. Found earlier this year, 800, a Civil War era gold Liberty coin. Some of the nicest examples known were found. Nobody knows for sure, but the theory is it was buried by Civil War purser because of so many single $1 pieces. Usually, the purser would bury the payroll prior to any conflicts, then dig up and disperse to the troops after battle. I guess that person didn't make it to dig them up. 160 years later, a corn farmer is prepping his field for the next crop and bam. What is this? Hat speps, Wubucoin world, conusus, coins gold, coin world, conusus, coins gold, coin, hoard, tailing 800 pieces, found in Kentucky. That animals, if trained enough, can smell out disease. A flock of pigeons was able to correctly spot cancer in breast tissue, biopsy images, with 99% accuracy, on par with human expert. TEPS, UW Science, or content article pigeons. Spot cancer. Well, human experts. Texted percent, 20 pigeons percent, 20 pigeons percent, 20%, 20%, 20%, 20%, 20%, 20%, 24%, 20 nonches percent, 20%. Everything having to do with Mad Jack Churchill. He reads like someone's self-insert Opke in historical fiction based on why, except he's all real. Except he's all real. He was a Brit who fought in World War IE without guns, instead preferring a longbow, a claymore sword, and bagpipe. Despite this, he won. A lot. He single-handedly took a whole village back from the Nazis by taking his shirt off and stealthing around to scare the crap out of them with his sword. After the Nazis captured him one time and held him prisoner under the mistaken belief he was related to Winston Churchill, the prison was raided by the Allies and he was set free. He would have, had he not already escaped 2 weeks prior. He was on the beach on D-Day with men under his command and held them up in their boat while he played a song on the bagpipes. Finished, lobbed a grenade onto the beach, and then charged. The war ended, and he was bored, so he went to the Pacific to go fight the Japanese. That ended too, so he got bored in retirement and invented river surfing. This is just a scrap of the historical anomaly that is Mad Jack Churchill. He ended up with an office job in London and commuted to work by train each day. If you ended up in a carriage with him on the way home in the evening, you'd be startled to see a respectable-looking older gentleman get up out of his seat, open a window, hurl his briefcase out, then sit down and keep reading his newspaper. The rail line ran right past his house, so he'd throw his briefcase into the backyard to save having to carry it home from the station and to let his wife know he'd be home soon and to put the kettle on.